Welcome back to the second week of Coding from Null. We're going to be continuing on building this really cool customizable coming soon page. So the next thing that we're going to cover after last week's introduction to Create React App and CSS Grid is we're going to be starting to implement this really cool countdown clock. It's really awesome. It's a React component that we just pass in a date sometime in the future, and it's going to render us out this countdown clock. This is really cool for the use case we're using it for a coming soon page to tell you when it's going to go live, but it's also really cool for stuff like an event or you have a sale going on. So there's a lot of cool use cases, and I'm really excited to start this one. So let's go ahead and start digging in. All right, so let's start building this countdown clock, right? So here I just wanted to have this up. This is the completed project here, just as an idea of what this will look like when we're all said and done today. It'll be this really cool just timer that'll count down. What we're going to be using to complete this is a library called Moment.js. It makes dealing with things like times and dates much easier for us. Of course, you could, and I would actually strongly suggest that you take the challenge to try to do it with just vanilla JavaScript, but we are going to be using this Moment.js library just to make our lives just a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and pull up our project here. Now, the first thing that we want to do is install the library that we're going to be using. And in order to do that, we're just going to go into our terminal, type npm install moment --save. Hit enter. That's going to grind for a bit, and then it's going to appear in our package.json under our dependencies. So let's let that work for a little bit. All right, now that that's all done, and now you see under our dependencies, we have Moment on there, which is exactly what we want. So now we've installed that library. Let's start building the component. So we'll go into our components folder here, and we'll want a new file. Take this out. I'm just messing up here. We'll go into our components, new file, and we are going to call this countdown.js. And I'm going to use this little snippet that I have here. It'll come up. And this is just going to give us a class component that we're going to be using to construct our countdown clock. Now, of course, you could type this all out by hand if you wanted to, and I will leave a link to the extension that I'm actually using for this snippet in the description so that you can go ahead and put it on your Visual Studio as well. It's super nice to have, makes writing components and stuff much faster and much easier. So we're importing React here, and what we also need to do is import some stuff from that Moment library that we just installed. So we'll say import and then Moment from should be in there, Moment. But there's also one other thing that we're going to need specifically from Moment, and that's called a duration. And what a duration allows us to do is we can specify in a point in time, and it will give us a duration, meaning like how many months, days, years, minutes, and seconds from now until then, which is exactly what we need for our countdown timer. We don't want, hey, how many days from now till then and how many hours. We want it to basically provide the modulo arithmetic that we would need to do if we were doing this in just vanilla JavaScript, and just say, hey, this is seconds, this is minutes, this is hours, this is days, and so on. So to do that, we're just going to say duration here from moment, and now we've got everything imported into our component that we need at this point to get up and running with the functionality. So for this particular one, what we're going to want to keep track of is just the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. You could extend this to months and years and whatever else you wanted to, but this is all we're going to be focusing on this particular clock. So what we want is a place to store all the information. And when we're working in React, we want to store our data in state. And so the state of this particular component is going to be comprised of days and then hours and we'll call these minutes and then seconds. And so this is all the information that we need to make our countdown timer work. So now that we have everything imported that we need and also all the state variables that we need, let's go ahead and start actually coding out exactly what the HTML is going to look like. So we're going to have a div, and it's going to have a class name of countdown. And then inside of that, let's see, we are going to need to write a little bit of JavaScript here. So what we want to do is we want to map over our state variable, and we want to create a countdown segment for each of these state variables. We want one for days, one for hours, one for minutes, one for seconds. And the reason why we're doing this way is because if we did want to extend this later, it'd be very easy to just pop in another state variable instead of having to rewrite any JavaScript. So that's why it's going to map over our state and basically iterate over it, and then it's going to give us the segment for the clock. So in order to get the key value from an array, we use a method that's called object.keys, because say we had an array, this would be the key, this would be the value. But we want the keys, we want the days, the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. So we'll say object.keys, which will return us a array of just the keys. And then we're going to pass that this.state. So it's going to loop over all of the keys in this.state, the days, hours, minutes, seconds, and give us an array of those. And then we want to map over those, and we will say key, and then I for the index, and then we will use a arrow function here. And for each of those, we want to create a segment for our clock. And our segment is just going to be another div and this is going to have a class name of, we will call this countdown segment. And now in each segment, we want a portion for the numbers, so the number of days, number of hours, and then also another one for the number, how many days is actually left or how many minutes is actually left. So we'll have a span here, and then we have a class name of countdown segment, and this will be the number. Okay, and then let's create another span here. And then this one is going to have a class name of countdown segment, and we'll just call this caption. And so for this one, for the segment number, we want to access state. So we're going to have to use curly braces again to use JavaScript here. And we are going to say this dot state and then square brackets, and we're going to say key. So at the index of key, it's going to give us the value, which is going to be, at this point, it'd be 0 for everything. But if we had 2 days, it'd give us 2 for this. And now in this one, what we want to get is actually just the days, hours, minutes, or seconds portion of it. So down here, again, to access our JavaScript, do curly braces, and we are going to just say the key, because that's all we want, and we're just going to put it as 2 uppercase so they all look nice and neat. And so that is pretty much it for the actual countdown clock itself. And now we got to start writing the functions to figure out from our state, or from the variable that we're going to be passing in to our component, how to set the state. So below our state, what we are going to do is write a little function that's just called set countdown. And what this is going to do, it's going to say, well, let's set a variable in here for the future date. And that is going to equal, we're going to use the moment function, and we're going to pass in this dot props dot future date. So we're going to, from our coming soon component over here, we're going to pass down a prop or some data about the future date of which we want this countdown timer to start counting down. And I should probably fix my spelling on this. And we are going to pass it to moment. And what moment's going to do is it's going to give us this really cool object to work with that's got a bunch of different things that we can use to access different portions of the date and time and all that stuff. We're not going to be using a bunch of that functionality. We're mainly going to be using duration, which we will get into here in just a second. But so one thing that we need is we need to know what is today as well, because we know the future date when this countdown clock is going to be counting down to, but we also need to know what is today. And so we'll say const today equals, and then we will say moment, but we just won't pass it anything. It's just moment. And what that's going to do is it's just going, if you ever call just the moment, it's just going to get you all that information about this moment in time, which is really cool. And so now we want to start looking at duration. So we'll say const, we'll just call this clock duration. And this is going to equal, we'll use the duration function. And what this is going to basically ask for is a difference in time. So we are going to use the diff function from moment as well to give us the difference from this future date and today, so that it can give us a duration in time between those two. And so we will say future date dot diff and then pass in today. So now what we need to get from this duration is our days, hours, minutes, and seconds of this duration. So the first one we want is days, and this one's going to look a little bit funkier than the rest, and I'll explain that in a second. We're going to say math.floor, and then we will say clock duration dot as days. So what we're doing here, because the clock duration, so if I have something that's months out, it's going to give me, the months and then the days after it's already calculated the months, right? So if it's 1 month and 2 days, it's going to say 1 month, 2 days. But if I'm only wanting the days, it's going to look weird because it's going to say there's only 2 days. But we know that there'd be 32, 33 days, something like that. And so since we are not using months in this calculation here, and I want to be able to set this out for a few months, but I just want it to calculate as days, I'm going to say const days and then floor. So it's going to give me the entire clock duration as days. So how many days in total? And then I'm just flooring that. So basically I'm taking because it'll probably be more than likely be a decimal. I want to floor that and just say, hey, give me just the integer, which will give me the how many days that's going to be. And so that's really the only one we got to do kind of that funky thing to. The rest of them, we're just going to say const hours equals clock duration dot hours. And we're going to do the same thing for minutes. And seconds as well. Okay, so now we have how many days, how many hours, how many minutes, and how many seconds we have between today and the future date that we're passing into this component. Now what we need to do is set our state. So when we've figured out all this, we want our state variable to update accordingly. And so how we do that is we just call this dot set state. And then we want to pass in the days, the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. And since we've named these all the same, we don't have to, you could say days is days would work just fine, but we can shorten this up to just days since we've named everything the same, and make it just look a little cleaner, a little nicer. So now that we've got our set countdown function all set up, we need somewhere to call this function from. And we are going to be using what React has as lifecycle methods. And these lifecycle methods give you access to a particular moment in time with the component. And we are going to be using this component did mount, which is going to give us access to when this component actually renders to the page, what we want to happen right then. And what we want to happen then is we want to say this dot set countdown. And we are just going to leave it empty like that. Now we have just a little bit of an issue with this right here because we're only calling this one time. So when the component mounts to the page, we'll call set countdown. It's going to figure out the, future date and then the difference between them and then the days, hours, minutes, seconds, all that. And then it's going to set the state. But this is never going to change. So, but we want this to be updating every second. So the reason we want to call this.set countdown first right away is because there will be a little bit of delay there if we set an interval, which we're going to do in just a second. But we want this to call straight away so that the clock appears right away and we don't get some zeros and then the countdown clock starts. So we want to say this.set countdown and set that straight away. And then after that, we are going to set an interval. So we will say this.interval is equal to set interval and use a callback function here. And this dot set countdown right? And then we want to have this interval run every second. And so this takes in a number of milliseconds. So this would be 1,000 milliseconds, will be 1 second. So when the component mounts to the page, it's going to call this.set countdown. It's going to get all that information so we don't have a funky, some zeros displaying at when it first mounts to the page. And then after that, it's going to go every second. It's going to call this function and find out how many hours, minutes, seconds we have left. Now we do have to take into account that we're setting an interval here on a React component, and we are actually going to need to clean this up when the component unmounts from the page, so we're not wasting any resources still trying to keep track of this interval here. So what we will do is we want access to when the component unmounts from the page, or when it will unmount from the page. So we will use component will unmount. And then we will simply just clean up that interval by calling clear interval and passing into it this dot interval. And then that will clean up that resource for us so it's still not trying to calculate the interval. All right, so we have all that set up now. So now let's look at actually using this component and kind of seeing exactly where we're at this point in time. So let's go over to our coming soon. And what we want to do is import this component into our main component here, which is the coming soon page. We will say import and countdown from ./countdown. And then instead of this here, we will say countdown. And we need to delete this out of here. And we need to pass into this some future date. So let's just say future date equals, and we will just use midnight of December 31st. Okay. So let's go ahead, we'll save all of this, and if we haven't messed anything up, we'll say npm start. This will start up, and then hopefully that'll give us a little countdown timer. All right, so we've got a little error here. Let's figure this out. So expected an assignment or function call and instead saw an expression. And it's saying that this is happening at line 47 in our countdown.js. So let's go ahead and look at that. Countdown.js. And we're getting a bunch of errors here. Expecting an assignment or function call instead saw. I see what's going on here. So what I did is I was writing an arrow function, but when we want to just return whatever's to the right of the arrow, we don't use the curly braces. We use just parentheses. So that should hopefully take care of that. Yep, compiled successfully. Let's go ahead and look at that. So now we've got 92 days, 8 hours, 50 minutes, and we see that it's counting down the seconds, which is exactly what we want to be seeing right now. And let's take a closer look at this countdown here. So let's wait till it goes down to 10 seconds here. And we'll see what happens. It's just going to say, and it's going to go straight to 9, 8, 7, 6. But we want to have it nice and uniform here. And so what we want to do is whenever it's 1 just one character here, we want it to add a leading 0 on the end. So these all look nice and uniform here. So this should actually have 08 hours here at this point in time. So let's go ahead and add that. This will be really easy. We're just going to add a little function in here that's called add zeros. And let's go ahead and just put this in between our state and our set countdown function. We'll just say add zeros, and we will pass in a value. And that value will turn into a string. So value, and then string is value. And then we will say while. And why we are getting the string is so we can get the length of it. So we will call value.length. And if this length is less than 2, we want to add a 0 to it. So we will say value equals, and we'll do some string interpolation here, and we will just say 0 value. And then at the end of this function, we will just return that value. So whenever it's less than 2, it's just going to append a 0 on the end of it. And where we want to call this from is right here. So instead of this.state.key, because remember, this is the number, it's going to look at the key, the hour, the day, the minute, what have you, and return us that number associated with that. So instead here, what we want to do is just say add zeros, and then pass in that this.state key. Now it's yelling at me here. It says add zeros is not defined. So we actually need to say this dot add zeros. So let's go ahead and give this a save. Compiled successfully. That's always good. And so now here, see at the seconds, we caught that just in time. This has got a 0 on the end of it. We also have 0 at the start, technically, I guess, of the hours. So we're looking good there as far as the formatting that we want to see. Now, before we start styling this, let's hop back over to our coming soon.js, because remember, we just put in this prop kind of generically here, but we actually want this to be passed in via state, and we're going to hold that state in coming soon. So in order to use state, you could use a hook here if you wanted to. We'll maybe go into hooks sometime towards the end of this tutorial. I haven't quite determined that yet or not, but really if you want state, you want to be using a class component, which is what we used in the countdown timer. We're using a class component here. See, class, countdown extends, and so that gives us access to state. And so we want to use that same thing here. So let's actually put this component right here. And then here we will say class, and then coming soon. And that extends component. And this is yelling at us here because now we need to use the render method. So we are going to say render, and then pop that out and put that right here. So now we have that. That's importing weird stuff because my typing skills are atrocious. So now we want to have this stored in state. So what we are going to do is set another state here, and we are going to say countdown. The reason we're doing this, you could just say future date, but I know that we are going to be using more components, and I want to specify that this is going to be for countdown. It'll make our lives a bit easier going forward. And then we will say future date, and that equals, and then I'll just pull this off. And now in our render method, we'll just put this const, and we will destructure our state. This really wouldn't be too necessary since we only have one here right now, but again, I know we're going to be adding more, so we'll just take care of it right now. And we are going to destructure our state and set it into countdown here. What that allows us to do, instead of when we want to access countdown, we can just say countdown instead of saying this.state.countdown. Every time we want to access something, we just say, hey, give me countdown. And so then here again, see, now we have access to countdown, future date. And so now if we save this, compiled successfully, and we look at it, nothing's changed here. It's still working, which is exactly what we want to see. We're just doing this a little bit differently so that we can hold all our applications data in the state for our highest order component, which is coming soon component, and that way it's all stored in the same spot. So now let's go ahead and start styling this sucker. So in our styles, just to keep everything nice and clean, we're just going to add a new style sheet. It's going to be called countdown.css. And let's just import that sucker right away. So let's close some of these that we don't need anymore. We really only need these two, and so let's go ahead and import that style sheet into here. We will say import, and then actually I think we just need to say import from dot slash, I think I'm messing this up here. That's right. I don't need from on there at all. I just need import the style sheet. So dot slash styles, and then countdown.css. Go ahead and give that a save. Compiled successfully, so we're still sitting pretty good. Really like this hot reloading feature of Create React App. It makes it really nice to develop things very quickly. So let's go ahead and pull this to the side here. We're going to really start using this now because we're going to just start styling it and seeing our styles every time that we save. So here I want to access countdown. So remember that we set the highest div, we set the class name to countdown, so countdown, and now I want this to display in this specific grid area here, which actually, let's go ahead, let's pull this up in Firefox instead. I think that'll help us out a bit here. So let's go to localhost and bring this out here, Control-Shift-I to bring up our developer tools, and then grid, and then here just say display area names. And so remember, if we look back at index.css, no, countdown.css, coming soon. There we go. Last but not least, so countdown, logo, title, description, subscribe, social. These are all the areas that we set up on that initial grid that we set up for the background. And we want this to always display in the countdown area. And so if we come back to countdown.css, we will say grid area countdown. Give that a save. Now this isn't going to change anything because this is already displaying, just happens to be displaying here for now, but we just want to make sure that that's set in that grid area that we want. And it also just makes things very clear when you go through, start reading things, and you can, pop up the display names, and that just makes things just look a little cleaner and nicer. So we have this displaying in the grid area countdown, and what we want to do here with the clock is display grid, so we can use CSS grid to start messing with how this is laid out. So we want this to display in 4 columns, right? Because we have one for days, one for hours, one for minutes, one for seconds. So we will say grid template columns, and then I will just say repeat, and I want to repeat this 4 times, min max, and we will say 50 pixels and 150 pixels. And so this will give us 4 columns, the minimum size of which is going to be 50 pixels. The maximum size is 150 pixels. And see how it's set up here as 4 columns now, which is exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and click off this div.background. We don't really need that one anymore. Let's start looking more closely at the countdown. See how when we added this display grid, we got this guy here in our developer tools, which is really nice. So now we can see our grid layout for our countdown. Let's go ahead and add some grid gap on there. Grid gap, we'll just use 10 pixels, give it a save, and we'll see now we have this little separation here. And give it just some padding on the bottom. I'll go 10 pixels that as well, and then we want to justify the content center. Give that a save. Should be looking good still. Now what we want to do is start with the segments themselves. So we will say dot countdown segment, and remember the segment is comprised of both the number and the caption as well. That's the entire segment, and we want a display grid on this as well. And then we'll do another grid gap on this so we can see exactly which one we're working with here. Grid gap, we'll just do 10 pixels on that as well. And then grid template columns, we're just going to be doing 1 FR. And we covered this a little bit before in the previous tutorial. So we only need 1 column, right? Where we want the number displayed up top and the seconds displayed below, which would end up as 2 rows. We don't really need to specify the rows. It'll automatically, based on however many it needs, it will just automatically do all the rows for us. Since we're saying, hey, I only want 1 column here, and I want it to stretch the entire length of the free room that I have available to me. So let's go ahead and save it. So now you can see we're definitely starting to get closer to the look that we want. So now let's start styling the actual number itself. Because remember, we want the number to kind of stand out. So we want it a little bit bigger than the caption. So we will say countdown dash segment and then number. And we will set the font size at 30 pixels. We want it to also be a little bit bolder, so we'll set the font weight at 700. And then we'll set a transition on this, because if you remember when we were hovering over it, let's bring back up the finished one. When we hover it over it, we have this little kind of grows a little bit or scales a little bit. And we just want to measure, we want to have control over how long that transition lasts for. And so we will just say transition. We will say all. This is going to last for 0.2 seconds. And we are going to just ease in. Okay. Go ahead and give that a save. We should see these pop up here. Looking very, very good. Now let's take care of that hover real quick. That nice little sort of animation that we have. So we'll say dot countdown segment number, and on hover we want to transform. We will use scale and then 1.1, and that'll just give us that nice tiny scale that we saw before. So we should hover over it and see it scale just a little bit. We might actually, let's bump that up just a little bit so we can see it. There we go. Now let's start styling that caption bit. So we will say dot countdown segment and then caption, and we will set the font size for that at 16 pixels, and the font weight we will set at 500. Go ahead, give that a save. And now we're definitely looking a lot closer to what we have in our finished product. The one thing that we're missing here is just that really cool border that we have. So we have this really cool like little segment border, and then when we shrink this down, we see once it gets to a certain size, because and I tested this out, once you get to a certain size, this really just doesn't start to look very nice. So then we just boop, and then now we just have this little bottom border here. And so how we do that, go ahead and minimize this a bit. So on our countdown, we'll just pop down here, and we'll say dot countdown, and then if the div is not the last child, so if it's not this guy, because we don't want a border here, a border here, a border here, and one at the end. We just want one here, and one here. So if it's not we will say last child, we want to have a border on the right. So we will say border right, and this will be 2 pixels, solid, and we'll use our CSS variables again, and we'll just use that nice green that we had. Go ahead and give that a save. And now we see that we have those nice little borders there. Let's go ahead and click off of this. We don't really need the grid too much anymore. So now we have those nice little borders there. And when we get down here, see, it kind of scrunches up a bit. It just doesn't look quite as nice once you get down real small. So when we change the area of the viewport down to past a certain point, we want this to readjust and then just put the border at the bottom here instead of on each of these segments. And so let's come down here and we'll just write a media query down here at the end. And how we use a media query, we just say at media, and then we say max width, and for this one we're going to say 500 pixels. So when the window gets down to 500 pixels, we want to change from this to having just a border on the bottom. And so we want the border on the bottom of countdown. So we'll access countdown, we'll say border bottom, and then this is going to be 5 pixels solid, and that same CSS variable of green. Go ahead and give that a save, and then you'll see if we start to move this down, once we get down to 500 pixels, that border will appear. But we don't want these on there as well, so how we get rid of those, we will just say dot countdown, and then div, and then not last child, just like we did before. And then we will just say border right 0 pixels. Give that a save, and now we've gotten rid of that. So we come out, we come back in, when we get to 500 pixels, those disappear, and then we get the nice little border on the bottom. And that is it. And then if we wanted to change this date here, we just go into countdown, coming soon, and say, oh, I want to change this to not 2019, we'll change this to 2020. And that is 458 days, 8 hours, 24 minutes, and 3 seconds. And so pretty much any date that we pass in, it's just going to count down from this point in time to that every second and give us this nice, cool countdown. And that's pretty much it for this one. We learned a lot. Hopefully this one was really fun. I really enjoyed doing this. I hope you guys really enjoyed it as well. If you did, make sure you hit that subscribe button and catch me next week where we will start digging into the nice little spinning logo that we had here. We look on the in project, we will start working on this guy here. So I will see you all next week.